Chapter 8. The Dutch-Komenda War, 1694 to 1699. On the 5th of September 1693, Captain Thomas Phillips sailed for the Gold Coast in the Hannibal of 450 tons and 36 guns, with Thomas Shirley in the East India Merchant of 30 guns. They were engaged in a slaving voyage, and one of the partners in the venture was Samuel Stanier, the sub-governor of the Royal African Company. They also had some soldiers on board for the company's garrisons, so that if they were not actually sailing under its flag, they doubtless held its license to trade. They arrived on the coast in 1694, and the account of this voyage that has been left by Captain Phillips gives an excellent idea of the state of affairs and mode of life there at this time. In spite of the fact that the Dutch West India Company and the English Royal African Company had both been granted the monopoly of the Gold Coast trade and were vested by their respective governments with the power to deal severely with those who infringed their rights, there were more than a dozen Dutch interlopers on the coast when Phillips arrived there. This interloping trade was a profitable one. The ships, the majority of which were Zealanders or French, used to trade quite openly, and as they were always chosen for their speed and were well manned and armed, fighting desperately rather than be captured, it was but seldom that any of them were taken. These illicit traders, moreover, having no settlements to maintain, were able to sell their goods from 25 to 30% cheaper than the companies could, and thus did enormous damage to their trade. They could also afford to give better prices for slaves or other cargo when the supply was limited, and thereby shortened their stay on the coast and had a quicker turnover. Nevertheless, the occupation was not without its risks, for the Dutch had power to put criminals of their nation to death after trial by court-martial, and whenever they succeeded in capturing one of these poaching ships, used to execute the officers and confine the crews in the dungeons of Elmina, unless, as not infrequently happened, it was made worth their while to adopt more lenient measures. The English, however, had less power, and could only send the offenders in irons to take their trial in England. While he was lying off Axum, Phillips was visited by Rawlinson, the Dutch factor at Fort St. Anthony, who accepted his invitation to stay, and proved a boon companion, taking his glass off very smartly, and singing and dancing several jigs by himself. Presently, however, he saw a large 12-hand canoe with a flag in it coming up from the eastward, and showed so much alarm that Phillips offered to fire on her, but Rawlinson, hastily begging him not to do so, sprang into his canoe, and, lying flat on his belly in the bottom of the boat, was paddled as fast as possible to westward, and following a circular course, eventually landed about a quarter of a mile from his fort. A little later, he sent a canoe out to scout, and then returned on board, resolved to have the other jug with them. He explained that his sudden departure had been due to the fear lest the canoe contained the fiscal from Elmina on one of his periodical tours of inspection. It was, however, only one of the stewards, Frank the butler, from Cape Coast Castle, who had been sent by the company's agent with letters and instructions for Phillips, and had picked up Buckeridge the factor at Dick's Cove on his way. The fort at Dick's Cove, though begun 3 years earlier, was as yet but half finished, and a few small guns planted in the open on the rocks were its sole means of defence. At Secondi, they found the English factor Johnson in bed, raving mad, and his assistant, a mere lad who had but recently left the Blue Coat Hospital, in charge of the fort. Johnson's madness was attributed to resentment against Van Heukelien, the Dutch factor at Elmina. One Taguba, a noted Negro wench in Cape Coast town, being gotten with child by some of the soldiers of the castle, was brought to bed of a mulatto girl, who, growing about 11 years old, this Johnson, then a factor at Cape Coast, had a great fancy for her, and purposed to take her for his wife, as they take wives in Guinea, and being about that time removed to be chief factor at Secundie. In order to make sure of the girl, he took her there to live with him till she was of age fit for conjugal embraces, using her with much tenderness, and taking great satisfaction in her company for 2 or 3 years. But when she was grown up, being a pretty girl, Van Heukelien, by bribes and presents, corrupted her mother Taguba, and prevailed with her to go to Secundie, and, under pretence of making a visit to her daughter, to bring her off in a swift canoe, which he had ordered to lie under the Dutch fort there for the purpose. The mother accordingly went, and having been kindly treated by Johnson, who suspected nothing, went with her daughter to take a walk. Being come near the place appointed, the watermen took her by force into the canoe, her mother following, and carried them both away to Van Heukelien, who soon cracked the nut Johnson had been so long cooking to his own tooth. When Phillips dined with the Dutch general at the Mina, he saw her there, being brought in to dance before them, very fine, bearing the title of Madame Van Heukelien. This and some other old differences between him and the Dutchman had quite turned his brain. At Chama they had a good trade for gold, but both there and at Komenda the people stood in great awe of the Dutch, who they were afraid might seize their goods to punish them for having traded with the English. This they often did, and it was quite immaterial whether the purchases had been made from a ship or at one of the African Company's forts. As they passed down to Cape Coast, they saluted Elmina Castle with 7 guns, and then anchored off Cape Coast Castle, where they lay for some time, as they had a great deal of cargo to land for the company. While they were there, Clayton, the commandant of Fort Royal, died and was buried in a spot known as Black Jack's Garden, between the castle and Fort Royal, which was the usual burial ground for Europeans. At Cape Coast they landed 30 soldiers for the castle garrison, in as good health as they left England, but in 2 months' time near half of them died. On another occasion, Captains Phillips and Shirley gave a dinner to the agent and the rest of the company's officers in a square summer house which stood in the castle garden. Each captain took 6 of his quarter-deck guns on shore, with which 11 rounds were fired as a salute at every toast. These volleys accompanying toasts were a regular custom at this time. Some time before this, the Dutch had instigated the King of VIII to refuse the Assassins permission to pass through his territory. These people used to bring a great deal of gold to Cape Coast Castle, and the Dutch hoped in this way to divert the trade to their own settlements. The king, having complied and plundered some of the traders on their way down, the Assassins declared war against him and were assisted by the English with arms and ammunition. The King of Sabo was also paid to help them, and the allied army inflicted a crushing defeat on the Fetus, whose king was forced to fly to Elmina for protection. The victorious army, consisting of about 20,000 men under the King of Sabo and Nympha de Tufuhin of Assin, returned to Cape Coast while Phillips was there, and was followed soon afterwards by the brother of the fugitive King of Fetu, who had been installed in his stead, and had now come down to swear allegiance to the English. From Cape Coast, Phillips and Shirley sailed to Anamabo, where they entertained Searle, the factor, and Cooper and Fazelman, the factors of Egia and the Dutch fort Vredenburg. They then went to Winneba, where Nicholas Buckeridge was now in charge. The factory here was only a little thatched house with no defence beyond that afforded by its mud walls, so that it is not surprising that it should already have been twice plundered by the people, and that the factor lived in continual dread of another attack. A proper fort was built, however, in this year. The Yagunas were ruled by a queen, which had been their custom from time immemorial. She was not allowed to marry, but brought male slaves whenever she pleased as paramours. Her eldest daughter, who succeeded to the stool, was granted a similar privilege so soon as she attained a marriageable age. These slaves were sold again whenever their mistresses grew tired of them, but if caught intriguing with other women, they lost their heads. All the female children were kept, but any males that were born to the queen or the heiress apparent were sold into slavery. This custom, so different to that of the neighbouring Akan tribes, together with the fact that the people have a language of their own which is entirely distinct from the tree, strongly supports the belief that they are descended from some of the survivors of the original inhabitants of the coastline prior to the date of the Great Fanti invasion. From Winneba, the ships went to Accra, where Captain Shirley died and was buried with naval honours in James Fort. While the corpse was being towed ashore, his own ship fired minute guns, and after the ceremony was over she fired a salute of 30 guns. The Hannibal fired 26, Fort James 20, and Fort Crèvecoeur and Christiansborg Castle, then in the hands of Assameni and his Akwamus, 16 each. The pallbearers were Captain Phillips, John Bloom, the factor of James Fort, Nicholas Buckeridge, factor at Winneba, and the Dutch factor from Fort Crèvecoeur. In September 1694, the Dutch Fort Orange at Secondi was surprised and plundered by the Ahantas, who at the same time massacred the crew of a Dutch vessel that had chanced to be at anchor in the road. The fort, however, was not destroyed, and the Dutch soon afterwards reoccupied it. The year 1694 saw the commencement of a war between the Dutch and the Comenders, which was destined to last for some years, during which it did an immense amount of damage to the Dutch trade, besides costing them very large sums of money. When Mr. Sweerts, in 1688, had overcome the opposition of the Commenders and built Fort Vredenburg, he had only accomplished his object by force of arms, and the Commenders, who had never willingly submitted to the presence of the Dutch, had been nursing their resentment ever since, and only required an excuse to break out into open rebellion. Such a pretext was given to them now by an attempt by the Dutch to reopen the old gold mine which the Portuguese were known to have worked at Abrobi. A party of miners was sent out from Holland and set to work to locate the mine. They commenced operations in a hill just above Komenda, which they thought must contain the object of their search, but this hill was believed by the Commenders to be the residence of the chief local god, and a few days later the miners were suddenly attacked and robbed of all they possessed, several of them being captured and kept prisoners for some time. The Dutch complained to the chief of Komenda, but he declined to accept any responsibility and said that the real author of this outrage was a native trader named John Cabes, who lived near Fort Vredenburg and had considerable dealings with the Dutch. This Cabes had formerly been concerned in the murder of some Dutchmen and had fled to Cape Coast, where he lived for some years as a servant or agent under the English. Later, however, he got into their debt and went over to the Dutch governor, Joel Smits, whom he bribed to let him off the punishment with which he had been threatened, and was given permission to settle in the village under Fort Vredenburg. In Bosman's opinion, he was so arrant a coward that he would never have dared to commit such an outrage as this except by the express orders of the chief, and this allegation against him was, therefore, merely an excuse made by the latter, who, though secretly determined to sever all connection with the Dutch, did not wish to declare his intentions too soon. Mr. Smits, however, was a hasty-tempered man, and would neither listen to advice nor wait to inquire further into the facts of the case, but collected a force of Elminas and went direct to John Cabes's village. Cabes came out to meet him, leading a sheep as a present, preparatory to clearing himself of the charge that had been preferred against him. The governor, however, was in no mood to listen to any arguments or excuses, and his men at once began to plunder Cabes's goods and loot the whole village. But even John, coward though he might be, was not prepared to submit quietly to treatment like this, and when he and his people tried to defend their property, a skirmish ensued, in which several men were wounded on either side. By this hasty proceeding, the Dutch had only aggravated the difficulty of their position, for they had aroused the ill will of John Cabes, who was now openly hostile, besides being still exposed to the secret enmity of the Komenda chief. Cabes promptly invited the English to come to Komenda, and made his peace with them by giving them a temporary settlement in one of his salt villages, and promising that so soon as he was able he would help them to re-establish themselves in their old fort, which had now been abandoned for some years. This they did very soon afterwards, to the great embarrassment of the Dutch, for the English fort was not only fully as large and strong as Fort Vredenburg, but had better ordnance and a tower which overlooked it, and was capable of being mounted with guns. War was now inevitable, and Mr. Smits engaged a force of Elmina and Cape Coast natives for about £5,000, and with this army might very well have succeeded in conquering the Comenders, whom they far outnumbered. But his rash disposition again asserted itself, and led him to threaten the Fantis and Sabos that so soon as he had defeated the Comenders, he would march his army against them also. The natural result of these premature boasts was the immediate alliance of the threatened tribes with the Comenders. The allied army opposed to the Dutch was thus made much stronger than their own, and in the first engagement the Dutch mercenaries suffered terrible losses, and, as those who were neither killed nor taken prisoners only saved themselves by flight, the Dutch found themselves not only without an army and £5,000 out of pocket, but with the most powerful of the coast tribes at open war with them also. Fortunately for them, however, a division occurred among the enemy which gave them an opportunity of extricating themselves from their difficulties, of which they were only too glad to avail themselves. A dispute arose between Abi Teki, the chief of Komenda, and his brother Teki Anken, as a result of which the latter came over to the Dutch, bringing the Adams and some other allies with him. The new army thus provided, a second attempt was made to subdue the Comenders, and in the battle which followed, both sides fought with such valor and determination that for some time the issue was in doubt. But at length the Dutch auxiliaries, thinking that they had gained the advantage, fell to plundering, and while they were thus engaged, Abiteki brought up reinforcements, who, advancing with their arms reversed, succeeded in deceiving the Dutch, who mistook them for a party of their friends. No sooner, however, had they got near enough than they opened so rapid and accurate a fire that the Dutch force was soon routed and fled in disorder to Fort Vredenburg, thus giving a second complete victory to the Comenders. No further action was taken until, on the death of Mr. Smits early in 1695, his successor, J. Staphorst, seeing the great losses that the company had already incurred by this war, opened negotiations for peace and succeeded so well that the commanders even undertook to make good the losses that the Dutch had sustained. Such a satisfactory termination of the trouble, however, by no means suited the English, whose aim it was to profit by the expulsion of the Dutch and thus get the whole of the Komenda trade into their own hands. They therefore pointed out to the chief that after his two signal victories it was not for him to give satisfaction, but rather to dictate his own terms, and further supported their argument by showing that the Dutch were not in a position to refuse him, but would have to purchase peace at whatever price he chose to demand. They also undertook to help him with arms and ammunition if he followed their advice. By these means, the commanders were prevailed upon to assume the offensive once more, and in 1695 they attacked Fort Vredenburg. William Bosman was the commandant and had less than 20 men, half of whom were sick, to serve the 20 guns. Finding that the commanders were resolved to attack him, he sent to Elmina, reporting his weak condition and asking for reinforcements and ammunition. 2 ships were sent and anchored off the fort, and Peter Hinken, the captain of one of them, sent a boat full of men to join the garrison. They had no sooner set foot on the beach, however, than they were furiously attacked by the commanders under the very guns of the fort, and lost several killed. Bosman could do nothing to help them, for on going to the guns to fire on the enemy, he found that through the treachery of the gunner, every one of them had been spiked. The gunner was therefore arrested and sent in irons to Elmina, but Bosman complains that though the governor swore that he would make a terrible example of him, he never did anything of the kind, but released him almost at once and promoted him to an even better position elsewhere very soon afterwards. Fortunately for the garrison, the commanders did not avail themselves of this opportunity to storm the fort, but went away to eat, and thus gave the garrison time to put the guns in order again. In the evening, however, they returned and attacked the fort. The Dutch were at a great disadvantage, for many of the embrasures had no doors to them, and Bosman says, the negroes poured small shot on us as thick as hail, insomuch that those few doors which were left to some gun holes were become like a target that had been shot at for a mark, and the very staff which our flag was fastened on, though it took up so little room, did not escape shot free. On one occasion, one of the enemy actually began to hack at the door with an axe, but he was killed, and no further attempt was made to gain admission in that way. One of the soldiers, who had the crown of his hat shot away, came to Bosman for some grenades, 2 of which he threw down to the enemy, telling them that they were something to eat. They at once crowded round, and stood for a time watching them burn, and were at first very agreeably diverted, but when they burst they so galled them that they had no great stomach to such another meal. The fight lasted 5 hours, but the Dutch had only 2 men killed, and the commanders, finding they could not take the fort, then drew off. The Dutch now realized that if they were to maintain their position and credit in the country, they must raise another army as quickly as possible. They therefore approached the Fantis, whose former enmity had by this time died out, and bargained with them to take the field and fight the commanders until they had utterly exterminated them, on payment of a sum of £900. But no sooner had this arrangement been made than the English paid the Fantis an additional £900 to remain neutral. Their chief, who seems to have had some sense of humour, demurred at this, but was promptly deposed and his stool given to a less fastidious person, so that, as the Fantis infinitely preferred to do nothing for 1,800 rather than fight for only half the sum. The only result the Dutch attained by these negotiations was the loss of their money. The Adams next agreed to ally themselves with the Dutch for something under £500, and a similar arrangement was made with the Assassins and the people of Cape Coast. They disagreed among themselves, however, over the division of the money, and in the end all that could be got from them was a promise that they would remain neutral. As a last resource, the services of the Denkerers were engaged for £800, but before they could do anything, a war broke out with their neighbours, and they were compelled to stay and defend their own country instead of coming down to help the Dutch. Both they and the Adams, however, had the honesty to return the money, but not a penny could ever be recovered from the Fantis. This, then, was the desperate condition of the Dutch when it occurred to them to employ their old ally Teki Ankan to sound his brother and report whether he was more in favour of peace or war. They found that he was as tired of the latter as they themselves were, and peace was then concluded on very satisfactory terms. In 1697, the Dutch began to build a small fort at Appam, but met with great opposition from the people, who besieged them almost continuously until 1702, so that it was not completed for several years. The Dutch then commemorated the perseverance they had shown by naming the fort Fort Ladysmith. Dix Cove Fort had only recently been finished, and in this year the people laid siege to it and very nearly succeeded in taking it. As it was, they compelled the factor to submit to their terms, by which he acknowledged that he had no power or authority over them, and agreed to join them in cheating all ships that called there by passing imitation gold on them. This compact was so well kept that the place soon became known as the False Mint of Guinea, and in 1701 two small ships, the cargo on one of which alone was valued at £1,700, sold their whole stock there and received nothing but this false gold in exchange. The manufacture of this imitation gold was a regular industry at Dix Cove, and it was sold by the makers at the rate of £1 in good gold for false gold of the apparent value of £20. On the 1st of June, 1698, the English fort at Secondi was attacked. The commandant, Johnson, and several of the garrison were killed, and the fort itself was plundered and burned. Nothing remained but the blackened outer walls, and though in about 1700 several attempts were made to rebuild it, the people proved so hostile that nothing could be done, and such trade as the place afforded remained entirely in the hands of the Dutch. A new fort had, however, been built before 1726, when Smith, the African Company's surveyor, visited the Gold Coast, for he gives a drawing of both forts and a ground plan of the English one. The Dutch had several ships at Secondi at this time, and were strongly suspected of having instigated the attack, but when a protest was forwarded to Director General John Van Sevenhuysen, he denied any complicity and explained the presence of the Dutch ships by saying that they had come in search of interlopers. But from some contemporary correspondence it seems quite clear that this charge against the Dutch was well founded. In a letter from the free English agents to the directors of the Royal African Company reporting this occurrence, and dated at Cape Coast the 26th of June, 1698, it is stated that the people who took the fort had been sent from Elmina, some in canoes and others by land, and that the English, warned of their hostile intentions, sent to the Dutch governor to protest. He admitted having sent them, but said that they had only come to collect a debt and refused to recall them. Moreover, From a letter from the English to the Dutch governor, it appears that an English sloop was in Secondi Road at the time, having put in on account of bad weather. She had lost both her anchors, and her captain, therefore, sent to borrow one from the Dutch ships. But the mate of the latter replied, "'Tis true we have enough, but do you think we will spare any to you? Do you not see we are sent to take your fort, and can you expect our help?" The English answered, "We must then perish," to which the Dutchman replied, "Why, then, perish, and the Lord have mercy upon your souls." From a second letter, dated the 2nd of June, 1698, it further appears that the Dutch factor allowed the goods that were taken from the English fort to be carried openly into Fort Orange, and that he turned the garrison away almost naked, and only ridiculed their misfortunes. In the face of this evidence, it is hardly possible to acquit the Dutch of complicity in the attack. The fortunate termination of the Dutch troubles with the Commenders so exasperated the English that in November 1698 they treacherously murdered Abbe Teki while he was visiting them at Cape Coast. The Commenders were determined to avenge the death of their chief, and Teki Anken, who was also concerned in this dastardly act, fled to Cape Coast and sought the protection of the English, whom he joined against his own people. The English then raised a large force of sabots and Cape Coast men, and placing Teki Anken in command, sent him against the Commenders. But the Dutch, though invited to join, refused to mix themselves up in this new quarrel. The Commenders, who were outnumbered by 4-1, were led by their Tufuhin, Amuteki, and completely routed the force under Teki Anken. Amuteki then sent some of the enemy's skulls to the Dutch governor at Elmina in token of his victory and as a sign of friendship. The messengers were well received and sent back with presents for the Tufuhin and the governor's thanks. The Dutch were now on such friendly terms with the Commenders that they had the best possible opportunity to damage the English, but they seem to have been prevented from doing so, principally by the intrigues of a native named Akim, who was much trusted by the governor, who constantly allowed himself to be guided by this man's advice. Akim used every means to irritate the governor against the Commenders. Some Elmina women were murdered at this time, and Akim pretended that this outrage had been perpetrated by the Fetus, though there is good reason to believe that it was really committed by agents of Akim and Teki Anken, in order that they might lay the blame at the door of the Fetus, who were allies of the Commenders. Be this as it may, Akim persuaded the governor to have a number of Fetus attacked when they came to the castle to trade, several of whom were killed and 80 more taken prisoners. This treacherous act was committed without the sanction or even the knowledge of the council. The English now attacked the Commenders again, and this time met with better success, for Amuteki, being wounded and dropping out of the fighting line, the Commenders, missing their general, lost confidence, and Teki Anken secured an easy victory, killing or taking prisoners many of the principal men. Teki Anken thus became the chief of Komenda, and the continual state of warfare in which the country had been kept for the past 4 or 5 years at last came to an end. The affairs of the Royal African Company and the subject of the trade to Africa generally had now been considered by Parliament, and an act was passed laying open the trade to all His Majesty's subjects for a period of 13 years from the 24th of June, 1698. A duty of 10% ad valorem was to be collected on all goods and merchandise exported to Africa, and the amount thus raised was to be paid over to the Royal African Company, to assist them in maintaining the castles and forts on which the safety of the trade so largely depended. In 1699, the company sent out special orders to the agent at Cape Coast Castle to lose no time in putting Fort Royal in a thorough state of repair. This important position had been neglected far too long. Nothing had been done to improve it since it was purchased from the Danes, and it was now little better than a heap of ruins. A model was now prepared, however, which, if it had been followed, would have made this fort the strongest on the whole coast, but though it was rebuilt, the original plan was only partly carried out.